You're standing in front of one of them right now, that massive stone face, the heavy brow, the long nose, the jaw set against the wind. You think you're looking at a head. You're not. You're looking at the top of something buried, and what's underneath the grass has been sitting there, hidden, for more than 500 years. Here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. The Easter Island heads are not heads. They have bodies, full torsos, arms, hands, curled fingers pressed against the stomach, sunk deep into the ground. And when archaeologists finally dug one out, they found something carved into its back that the official story about this island cannot explain. I'm going to show you exactly what came out of the ground between 2010 and 2012. I'm going to show you a soil report from 2019 that quietly rewrote why these things were built at all. None of this is legend. All of it traces back to named excavations, real coordinates, and measurements you can check. I remember the night this stopped being a casual curiosity for me. I was scrolling through a field photo from the quarry, and I noticed the dirt line sat at the statue's chin, and I thought, wait, why does the ground stop exactly there? That one question cost me 2 years. So let me hand you what I found. Start with the number that most people never hear. There are almost 900 of these statues on the island. The islanders call them Moai, not heads, Moai. The average one stands about 4 meters tall and weighs around 12.5 tons. The largest one ever raised onto a platform, a Moai, the researchers nicknamed Paro, stood nearly 10 meters high and weighed close to 82 tons. And there is one still lying unfinished in the rock, a giant the workers abandoned mid-carving, that measures almost 21 meters from head to base. If they had ever stood it up, it would have weighed somewhere around 270 tons. Now, hold those numbers in your mind because they matter for what comes next. For most of the 20th century, the picture everyone carried was simple. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as the people who live there call it, was a tiny volcanic dot in the South Pacific, more than 3,500 kilometers off the coast of Chile. A society carved these giants, dragged them to the coast, stood them up facing inland, and then, the story goes, collapsed, ran out of trees, ran out of food, fell into chaos. And the statues at the quarry, the ones only showing their heads, those were supposedly just leftovers. Half-finished products stuck in a factory that shut down when the workforce died out. That's the version in the textbooks. That's the version the tour guides tell. Abandoned, incomplete, a monument to a civilization that supposedly ate itself alive. And for a long time, I believed it too. I assumed there was a boring answer, and I went looking for it, fully expecting to close the file and move on. But the deeper I read, the less the ground itself agreed with the story. Because here is the first thing that doesn't fit. If those quarry statues were just abandoned half-products, why do so many of them have complete, finished bodies hidden under the soil? You don't finish the arms, the hands, the fingers, and the full torso of something you intend to leave lying in a pit. And that is exactly what the excavation revealed. Let me take you to the dig. The woman who ran it is Dr. Jo-Ann Van Tilburg, an archaeologist from the University of California, Los Angeles, based at the Kotzen Institute of Archaeology. She has spent literally decades on this island. She founded something called the Easter Island Statue Project, and by the time she started digging, she and her team had already surveyed and documented close to 1,000 of these statues, one by one, measuring each. This is not a weekend tourist with a shovel. This is the single most complete statue survey ever done on Rapa Nui. Between 2010 and 2012, her team fully excavated 2 of the Moai standing in the slope of the quarry called Rano Raraku. In her own records, these 2 are cataloged with numbers, part of the inventory she built. And when they cleared away the earth, meter after meter, the so-called heads kept going down, almost 7 meters down for some of them. Think about that. The part you see, the famous face in every photograph, is sometimes only the top third of the whole thing. The rest, the entire body, was underground. Buried not because someone buried it on purpose in a single day, but because for 5 centuries, rain washed sediment down the slope of the volcano and slowly swallowed them, up past the shoulders, up past the neck, until only the faces remained looking out. The island filled them in, and once you accept that, a colder question arrives. If the earth buried them slowly over hundreds of years, and the statues were standing upright and finished the whole time, then they were never abandoned junk at all. They were standing exactly where their makers wanted them, upright, deliberate, facing outward. The quarry wasn't a scrapyard. It was a place where these things were meant to stand. But that was only the beginning of what came out of that pit. Because when they cleared the soil off the buried torsos, the stone was not blank. The backs of these two statues were covered in carvings, petroglyphs, deliberate designs cut into the stone and then hidden from view for centuries by the rising dirt. The most striking of them is a large curved shape, a crescent, carved across the lower back of the figure. Van Tilburg's team interpreted this crescent as a vaka, the Rapa Nui word for a canoe. A canoe carved into the back of a statue that no one was ever meant to see again once the ground rose over it. Why carve something that detailed on a surface destined to be buried? And it gets stranger. Down in the soil against the base of the statues, the excavators found something red pigment, a concentrated deposit of red ochre packed around the stone. On this island, red was not a decoration you threw around casually. Red was sacred. Red was the color reserved for ceremony, for status, for the top knots of hair that were placed on the most important figures. Someone had brought red pigment to the base of these statues and worked it into the ground around them. You do not perform a color ceremony at the foot of a garbage pile. Let me stop here because I know exactly what a reasonable person is thinking right now. I thought it myself for months. So this next part is for you, the skeptic, the one who wants the ordinary explanation, because you are the person I most want to convince, and I am not going to hand you anything I could not back up. The conventional answer goes like this. Of course, the statues in the quarry have bodies. All the Moai have bodies. The ones standing on the stone platforms by the sea, the ahu, those show their full torsos above ground because they were placed on flat, cleared ground. The ones in the quarry only show heads because they were still parked on the slope, waiting to be moved to the coast. And while they waited, natural erosion buried them, so the bodies were never a secret. The burial was just an accident of geology. Case closed. And you know what? Part of that is completely true. The erosion is real, the slow burial by sediment is real and well documented. I am not going to insult you by pretending the dirt got there by magic. But here is where that tidy explanation cracks apart. If these were just statues parked temporarily, waiting for transport to the coast, then they were unfinished works in a holding pattern. Temporary, functional, nothing sacred about them yet. Because in the standard story, a Moai only becomes a spiritual object once it reaches its platform and gets its eyes installed. So, why are these supposedly temporary in-transit statues finished down to the fingers? Why are their backs carved with sacred canoe symbols? Why is there ceremonial red pigment packed into the soil at their feet? Why did the excavators find, right there in the same soil layers, evidence of activity that looks like ritual rather than construction? You do not decorate, consecrate, and hold ceremonies around a product you are about to load onto rollers and haul 3 miles down to the beach. The physical evidence in that pit describes statues that were installed. Statues with a purpose right where they stood. And that quietly demolishes the idea that the quarry was only a factory floor. The conventional explanation covers the dirt. It does not cover the carvings, the pigment, or the ceremony. And that gap is where the real mystery lives. Which brings me to the part of this story that made me genuinely angry when I understood it. For decades, the dominant narrative about this island was not just that the statues were abandoned. It was that the entire civilization committed a kind of suicide. The word people used was ecocide. The claim was that the Rapa Nui cut down every last tree on their island to move these statues, destroyed their own soil, starved and descended into warfare and even cannibalism, until only a broken remnant was left when Europeans arrived. This story became famous. It got written up in best-selling books as the great cautionary tale of humans wrecking their own environment. And the quarry full of half-buried heads was used as exhibit number 1. Look, they'd say. They dropped their tools mid-carving. They abandoned the giant in the rock. The society collapsed so fast the statues froze in place like a snapshot of the disaster. But the physical record on the ground does not support a panicked collapse at the quarry. It shows the opposite. It shows care. It shows finished work, ritual deposits, deliberate placement, and repeated ceremonial activity over long periods. And that raises a very uncomfortable question about why the collapse story was pushed so hard and questioned so little. Because it turns out the people who could have re-examined the quarry evidence had a very appealing story already written, and a neat morality tale is a hard thing to give up. So let me show you what the reanalysis actually found when someone finally tested the ground instead of the legend. Dr. Van Tilburg's team did not just dig out statues, they took the dirt seriously. They brought in a geoarchaeologist, Dr. Sarah Sherwood, a soil specialist, and they analyzed the sediment layers around the buried Moai the way you would analyze a crime scene, looking at what the soil was actually made of, chemically, layer by layer. And in 2019, they published what they found in a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports. This is not a rumor from a forum. It is a citable paper with named authors and hard chemistry. Here's what the soil said. The ground in the Rano Raraku quarry, the exact place where nearly 400 Moai still stand, was not depleted, exhausted dirt from a dying society. It was some of the most fertile soil on the entire island. The samples came back loaded with the nutrients that plants crave most, high in calcium, high in phosphorus, rich in potassium, and in nitrogen, and in other elements that make a garden explode with life. You just felt it, didn't you? That moment where the tidy textbook answer cracks, and you realize the official story left something out on purpose. That itch to keep pulling on the thread instead of accepting the neat, sad little ending someone handed you, that's exactly the feeling I built the Lost Origins Complete Library around. It's 3 digital volumes you can read on any device, no special app needed, and it teaches you the one skill this whole video depends on: how to read contested evidence without being fooled. The first volume, First Threshold, walks you through real archaeological controversies from the ground up. The second, Deep Signal, hands you the grammar of evidence itself, how to weigh new data against old assumptions the way we just did with that soil report. And the third, Hidden Systems, ties every framework into one complete casebook you won't find anywhere else. Here's something you can test for yourself tonight, for free. Take that ecocide collapse story you've heard your whole life. Look up the peer-reviewed soil study these archaeologists published, and check the nutrient chemistry against the legend yourself, the same way I did. The fastest way to get the books is to scan the QR code right there on your screen, or go to the link in the description or the pinned comment. And listen, this matters more than any date on a calendar, because every day the official version goes unquestioned, another quiet truth stays buried under somebody's convenient story. But before we go any further into the soil, I owe you the skeptic's version, because I know exactly what a reasonable person is thinking right now. Dr. Sherwood said, in plain language, that everywhere else on the island, the soil was being worn out and stripped of nutrients by farming and by the weather, but not here. Here in the quarry, the soil was continuously replenished. It kept refilling itself. Why? Because of the rock itself. The Moai were carved from a specific stone, a volcanic ash called lapilli tuff, the compressed remains of ancient eruptions. And as the workers carved the statues, and as the natural bedrock of that crater weathered and broke down, it released those exact nutrients straight into the soil. The very process of making the statues and the very geology of the quarry turned that one spot into a natural fertilizer factory. The ground fed itself. Now put every piece we have collected back on the table together. The statues in the quarry are not half-finished junk. They are finished, down to the fingers. Their backs are carved with sacred canoe symbols meant to face the earth. Red ceremonial pigment was packed into the soil at their feet. They stood upright, deliberately placed, for centuries. And the ground they stand in is the single most fertile, self-renewing patch of earth on an island that everyone was told had starved itself to death. Do you see it now? Do you see why the abandonment story falls apart? The quarry was not a factory that shut down when the world ended. The quarry was a garden, a sacred garden, and the Moai standing in it were not waiting to be shipped away. Many of them were placed there on purpose, standing guard over the most life-giving soil the island possessed. The archaeologists themselves reached this conclusion. Van Tilburg and her team proposed that these particular statues had a specific role, that their presence in that fertile ground was tied to the fertility itself, that the Rapa Nui may have understood, in their own way, that this was sacred, productive earth and marked it with the most powerful objects they could make. The statues were not the tombstones of a dead civilization. They were the guardians of a living one, a monument to growth, not to collapse. Let that flip in your head for a second. Every photograph you have ever seen of those lonely heads sticking out of the hillside, the image the whole world uses as a symbol of a society that destroyed itself, is actually a picture of the opposite. It is a picture of people who found the richest soil on their island and honored it. And this is where the whole ecocide legend really starts to come undone, because the soil was only the first crack. For years, the collapse story leaned on the claim that the population crashed catastrophically before Europeans ever arrived, that the islanders wiped themselves out. But look closer at what actually happened after the first outside ships showed up. The first recorded European contact was on Easter Sunday in 1722, when a Dutch expedition, led by Jacob Roggeveen, anchored offshore. That is where the island got the name Easter Island. And the Dutch did not describe a shattered wasteland of cannibals. They described people farming, living, functioning. The true catastrophe came later, and it did not come from the islanders. In the 1860s, slave raiders from Peru descended on Rapa Nui and abducted huge numbers of people, including much of the ruling and knowledge-keeping class, the very people who held the oral history of what the statues meant. Then came diseases carried from the outside, smallpox and others, against which the islanders had no defense. Within a few years, the population collapsed to just over 100 survivors. Barely 100 people left out of thousands. That is the real reason so much of the meaning behind the Moai was lost. Not because a mad society burned itself out carving statues. Because the people who knew the answers were taken and killed, and the ones who could have told us why a canoe was carved on a buried back, or why red pigment was pressed into that sacred soil, were gone before anyone thought to ask. So when the standard textbooks blamed the islanders for their own destruction, they were pointing at the victims. And the quarry, with its silent, half-buried giants, was used as the poster image for a self-inflicted apocalypse that the physical evidence never actually supported. And there is more that modern tools keep pulling out of that ground. Researchers using detailed mapping and satellite-based analysis, along with fresh fieldwork, have shown that the Moai on their coastal platforms line up with something the islanders desperately needed: fresh water. Rapa Nui has almost no streams. Rain sinks straight through the porous volcanic rock and only re-emerges at certain coastal seeps, places where fresh groundwater bubbles out near the shore. And when scientists mapped where the platforms and statues stood, a pattern appeared. The monuments cluster near those precious freshwater sources. Carl Lipo and colleagues, studying the distribution, argued the statues mark and guard the island's most vital resources. Do you feel the theme repeating? Water on the coast? Fertile soil in the quarry. Again and again, these statues are standing over the things that keep people alive. That is not the behavior of a society in freefall. That is a society that mapped its own survival in stone. And still, the biggest single question hung over everything I read: how? How did a small island community move statues weighing up to 82 tons, kilometers, across rough terrain, without cranes, without draft animals, without metal, without wheels, as we know them? For decades, that impossibility fed the wildest theories. Lost technology, outside help, things I will not dignify here. But the islanders themselves had always given the answer, and nobody believed them. The old oral tradition said the Moai walked to their places. Walked? It sounds like a fairy tale. And that is exactly why researchers dismissed it for generations. Then, in 2012, two archaeologists, Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, decided to actually test the words instead of laughing at them. They built a faithful concrete replica of a real Moai, weighing about 5 tons. They tied 3 sets of ropes to it, top left, top right, and back. Then, a team of just 18 people took the ropes and began to rock it side to side, pulling in rhythm. And the statue walked, rocking from edge to edge, tilting forward with each sway. That multi-ton figure moved itself down a road in an upright, shuffling waddle. 18 people. A few ropes? No machines. They moved it about 100 meters in, well under an hour. And when you understand the walking method, the shape of the Moai finally makes sense, because the statues built for transport have a specific forward lean and a wide, D-shaped rounded base, exactly the design you would want to rock a giant forward on its edges. The bellies bulge. The center of gravity sits low and forward. They were engineered to walk. The oral tradition was right the whole time. The islanders told us in their own words, and the modern world assumed the natives were speaking in myth when they were actually handing over the engineering manual. So think about what we have rebuilt here, piece by piece, from the actual evidence. We started with a head sticking out of the dirt and a story that said it was abandoned junk from a suicidal civilization. And every single time we tested that story against the ground, it failed. The heads had finished bodies. The bodies had sacred carvings hidden underground. The soil at their feet was the richest on the island, refilling itself with nutrients from the very rock the statues were carved from. The coastal statues guard the fresh water. The whole population collapse was driven by slave raiders and disease from outside, not by the islanders eating themselves alive. And the impossible transport was never impossible at all, because the people who built them told us how, and we finally listened only a decade ago. Now I want to give you the single detail that, for me, closed the case. The thing that made me sit back from my desk and just stare at the wall for a while. Ugh. Go back to that 2019 soil study, to the calcium and the phosphorus and the self-renewing ground. Dr. Sarah Sherwood, the geoarchaeologist, said something in the reporting around that paper that I have not been able to shake. She said that when she saw the chemistry come back, she genuinely could not believe how rich the deposits were, that this was some of the most fertile soil in the whole region, and that nothing on the rest of the exhausted island looked anything like it. And here is the piece that ties the entire 500-year mystery into a single knot. The Rapa Nui carved these giants out of that quarry. The act of quarrying, breaking down that specific volcanic tuff, was itself feeding nutrients into the surrounding soil. So the statue making and the food growing were not two separate activities happening in two separate places. They were the same activity in the same sacred spot. The people were carving gods and, in the very same motion, enriching the earth that fed their children. The quarry was a temple and a farm fused into one. That is why the statues stayed. That is why they were finished and decorated and consecrated with red and left standing in the ground instead of being hauled away. They belonged there. They were part of the cycle. The heads we photograph as a symbol of death are actually rooted, quite literally, in the most alive ground on the island. The whole world looked at those buried faces and saw an ending. The evidence in the soil says it was the exact opposite. It was a place of renewal, protected by giants, hidden under 5 centuries of dirt, and misread by everyone who preferred a tragedy to the truth. That is the feeling I want to leave you with. Not that a mystery was solved, but that a lie about a whole people was quietly overturned. One soil sample and one buried torso at a time, and hardly anyone noticed the story had changed. You made it to the end of this, which tells me something about you. You are the kind of person who is not satisfied when someone hands you a neat, sad little answer and tells you to stop asking. You want to see what's actually under the dirt. That is the only kind of person who ever finds out. So let me ask you something specific, and I really do want your answer. That crescent carved into the buried back of the Moai, the shape the archaeologists read as a canoe, hidden on a surface no living person was meant to see again. What do you think it truly meant? A vessel to carry the spirit? A map? A signature? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I read them, and the best theories I have ever gotten came from people just like you. If this is your kind of obsession, stay with me, because we keep reopening the cases everyone else already stamped as closed. There is a set of stones on the far side of the Pacific with drill marks that, by every mainstream date, should not exist yet. That is where I'm going next. Come find out with me. This video gave you the overview, but the buried carvings and soil report, decoded in full, are waiting inside the Unexplained Society, picking up exactly where we stopped. In there, you can ask me your own questions, and a real person, me, answers you myself, never a machine. You'd be joining thousands of mystery lovers just like you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on your screen. Cancel anytime with one click. Now, if those buried statues amazed you, wait until you see this. Next, we uncover who truly built Göbekli Tepe, with real evidence that changes everything we thought we knew. It's starting right here.